People of my vintage have traditionally had one career throughout their working lives, and I'm no exception. And in my career, I've had two maxims. The first of which is I borrowed from a doctor. Rather than physician, heal thyself, it's teacher, learn something. But I'll be the first to admit that I haven't always followed that rule I've imposed upon myself. But on the odd occasion that I have, it's paid wonderful dividends. Now, I was trained as a teacher many years ago, and at that time, the prevailing philosophy of the universities for training teachers was what you're going to do with your students is to imbue them with the skills they need for life, whether it's language skills, speaking in public skills, research skills. It's whatever they need to function in Canadian society. And to us, that made sense, so that's how we proceeded. And our students, for the most part, fell into lockstep with that because many of my students, who are adult learners, came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and in their cultures, that's the way they approach education as well. So we were in sync. And for the first few years, everything seemed to be as it should have been. Nevertheless, within our staff room, for those first few years that we'd worked together, we knew something was not right. For one thing, it was boring. Tuesday's lesson could have been Thursdays. Wednesdays could have been Mondays. They sort of blurred to each other because each day the expectation was the same. We'd present a new skill, we'd review a new skill. Students would duly write down notes, hand in homework, and do homework over the weekend. So it was fine, but it was not satisfying. It was too routine. But in addition to our ennui about our lessons, there was something much more profound at work here. Something was really missing from what we were trying to help our students with. Now, as it so happens, our school, every year in April, we have a conference. And we always look forward to it with anticipation, not necessarily because we're going to learn anything, because it's in Harrison Hot Springs. It's a nice break in the school year, and we look forward to soaking in the nice water. And if we did learn something from a speaker, that was a bonus. Well, one year in the 1990s, we did have the good fortune to meet a speaker who told us it was okay if students brought their own experience to compare with what we're learning, as well as use their original native tongues. So we thought when we were soaking in the hot water, that's a wonderful idea. Just think of the possibilities. Well, the problem is, by the time we left Harrison Hot Springs, went back to our school, that magic sort of evaporated when we realized that we didn't feel confident doing it. We had no directive from above high. We didn't know how to begin and how far to go. So like many things we could have done, we left them on the back burner with this vague idea we'd get back to it later. Now, I was fortunate because I had one particular class who was amenable to anything. If I tried to do a thing, they go along with it. They were really keen. So I thought, well, if I'm going to do anything different, this would be the group I would do it with. And I did. 10 years later, day one of English 11, students came into the classroom on the first day, and the last student to arrive sat at the farthest point from my desk. I remember distinctly that day because she was wearing a beautiful blue hijab. Her clothes were gorgeous, and she had a luminous smile for everyone, but she was very shy. And so it wasn't too surprising to me that she sat further away. Typically, students who don't want to get involved sit on the peripheral, and she got on the most peripheral point of all. So my teacher antenna went up and said, okay, she's going to have trouble talking. She may have trouble with writing, but she will make some progress because she seems friendly. And as a self-fulfilling prophecy, that's what happened, at least in my eyes, for the first month or so. She got along with the people around her. She was communicative. And slowly but surely, her writing improved from the traditional literal response to what she was reading to adding a few more details, adding some new words. So in my eyes, she was improving. Then I thought the time was ripe for making a connection to something else. We had read a story where the main character was in an untenable position. And I wanted my students to relate to that, to a situation they experienced or they knew of someone else who had experienced it. Now, when Reza started writing, her pen was like this. She didn't write, she flowed. It was like a babbling brook. I can still see it. So I was eagerly anticipating what she wrote. And when I got it back, was this incredible tale of courage. She had to leave Afghanistan on foot with a child in tow, 200 kilometers through mountainous country into Pakistan to escape the Taliban. And she had left behind several deceased family members. And I thought, could this be the same timid, shy, albeit friendly Reza, this woman who had this incredible experience, who ended up spending at least a year in a refugee camp in Turkey, then in Greece before coming to Canada? 10 years later, Reza reappeared in the form of Sarah, a younger student. Again, beautiful smile, flowing dark hair, a smile for people around her, but she sat in the exact same spot, as far away from me as possible, where Reza had sat 10 years before. And I immediately had that flashback. I wonder if this is another Reza in the making. And she was very friendly enough. The students around her talked to her quite a bit. They learned a lot more about her than I did. Then, once I felt the class was comfortable, I gave the exercise which allowed them to use their own lives. In this particular exercise, they had to take a concept and give it a concrete example from their own experience. So words like love, forgiveness, courage, fear, those kind of things. And the students, for the most part, picked the predictable ones: love, courage, fear, honesty. Sarah was the only one to pick ambivalence. And I thought, well, Sarah doesn't usually stand out. Why did she pick the most difficult word that nobody else picked? So when I read her sentence, ambivalence is finally marrying the man you've loved for years while bombs exploded all around you. When I read that, I thought, oh, I wanted to know more. So I told Sarah, out of earshot of other students, the next time I give it a paragraph assignment, don't do what they're doing. I want you to continue this story because I want to know what happened. And when she wrote it, again, the pen flowed, 2, 3, 4 pages, uninterrupted writing, no scratching out. And when I read it, I took my teacher's pen, put it down, and read it not as a teacher looking for grammatical sins, but as a fascinated reader. She told this incredible story of jumping into a Jeep right after the ceremony, speeding through out of town that was disintegrating all around them, getting to the Mediterranean coast where other refugees were waiting, getting into a really rickety boat headed for Greece, where she and her husband stayed for over a year as refugees. Today, I'm pleased to say that Sarah and her husband have 2 additions to their family. They recently became Canadian citizens, And in an amazing gesture, they changed their surname to that of the family that sponsored them. She's now attending university. Now, neither Sarah's nor Ray's stories may have come to fruition had it not been for another student I'd known 10 years before Reza came in. It was 1996, in the spring, day one of the term, English 11, and like the other two, this student came last, sat in the general area far away. But this was fairly early in my career. I hadn't learned to get rid of my preconceived notions of what students would be. And when I saw him, roughly 18 years old, looking furtively, not seeing anybody, and when he sat down, his eyes lowered to about this angle, I'm sure if he was in my class today, he'd be doing this on his phone, but we didn't have them then. So instead, he just stared like this. So, my preconceived notions. He's a teenager who didn't make it through high school, probably for some sort of academic deficiency. He has a very bad attitude about learning, and he has no goals or ambitions because he hasn't figured himself out yet. So that's the way in those days, I would have proceeded, and I did. I'm embarrassed to admit now. Now, this was the same time that we had the conference at Harrison Hot Springs. I tried the connection idea in a foundations class before, so I thought, well, I'll try it with the grade 11s this time. Now, by sheer good luck, I got John with three women roughly in their mid-30s, because I chose the groups at random. I didn't plan this at all. All three of them spoke different languages, which means they had to communicate in English. And John, being the only native speaker, became their de facto leader, even though he didn't want to. But they really encouraged him. I believe they sensed his insecurity, his self-doubt, and they took a real maternal shine to John, and they really prompted him to put more into his work and to become a better self-advocate. And it began to show dividends when I started to read John's writing. Gone were the literal responses that minimally required what the question asked. He would add things like, well, this is the answer, but I think it could also be something else. Or, the writer did the character this way, but I think the writer got it wrong. So he was taking that courage of getting outside the school mentality of finding the right answer. Not too long after that, students had to write an essay making a connection with any character of a novel we're reading, and John took a secondary character, but again, gone was the tiny scrawl of writing that usually indicated some sort of insecurity. His letters became a little bigger. He didn't stop. He kept going. And I was just sitting there watching it. Is this the same kid? And when I read John's writing, I was flabbergasted. I mean, his writing had improved, but I talked to him later and said, John, where did this come from? I mean, I know you're getting better, but well, this is night and day. And then John, as he typically did, tried to tell me by looking in the eye, but he just couldn't do it. So he would look down. But to his credit, he did try. He's looked up every so often. He said, well, that character, yeah, I know he's not real, but the writer must have known somebody like that, because that's exactly how I interpreted my life at this point. At the end of the term, John's mother came to the class. She had brought a whole bunch of food, as did other students, because our tradition is to have a potluck at our last class. And then she took me aside out of earshot of John, and she said, I just wanted you to know that between your class and the other teacher's math class, it's the first time John has felt very comfortable being himself and saying what he thinks. In high school, there was too much peer pressure, and he's had this belief that nobody would be interested in what he thought. Now, to this day, I am ever grateful to John, both here and here, because 4 years later, our second child was born, and he was diagnosed, well, not diagnosed. The doctors said later when our son had trouble with speech and whatnot, that he's on the autism spectrum. Now, I could have panicked, been fraught with worry, but I was those things to a certain degree, but not nearly so much, because John was also autistic. His mother told me that he was, and when she did at the time, I had no idea what that was. It was a relatively new diagnosis, and certainly in the world of education, we did not know how to approach it. Now, our son had the benefit of teachers who were well-versed in autism training and behavioral therapists who were likewise trained. John didn't have that. Yet somehow he still managed to break through and become successful at school in his last 2 years. He would later join the armed forces. Now, next year, 2023, will have been my 30th year of teaching. And that brings me to my second maxim, something my father told me a long time ago. He said, it's good for any teacher to periodically ask himself or herself, have you really taught for 30 years? Or did you teach 1 year 30 times? I'd like to think that it was the former for me, at least to some extent. And if it is, I have Sarah, Reza, and John to thank for that.